Chapter 4, Dilkusha. 1975. His history class had gone on late that afternoon, and though Canty ran all the way from the bus stop, it was almost 20 to 4 by the time he reached the gate of Raj's school. The street looked oddly naked without its familiar row of waiting cars, and the little knot of mothers who usually stood chatting by the fence had claimed their children and gone home to start the tea. Raj wasn't there. The crossing lady was holding up her flag. "Did you notice a little kid waiting here?" Canty asked her. "A first-class kid." He hesitated and then added, "A dark-haired boy, like me." "Sorry, love, didn't see." She waved at the stream of cars rushing down Wellington Road. "Had my eye on the traffic most of the time." She glanced down the side street where a last small gang of kids was straggling around the corner into Laurel Avenue. "Perhaps he's gone home with a mate." Canty knew Raj wouldn't have done that. Their mother had told him he must always wait for his brother. He turned in through the gate and hurried across the playgrounds towards the infants' block, knowing he'd find him there. It was the most likely thing in the world that Raj had been kept in again. A spindly palm grew by the steps, all out of place and on its own. Raj had told him a kid in the class called it the monkey tree. "And you know what he said to me then?" Raj had asked indignantly. "What?" "He said, 'And now we've got a real-life monkey to go in it.' He meant me." Raj had thumped the kid. That had been his first fight at school, on his very first day. Canty had tried to explain, "Look, little kids, they always pick out the differences. If you were really small, shorter than the others, they'd call you midget. If you had a limp, it would be hoppy. They don't mean it, not really." "Yes, they do," Raj had insisted. "They do mean it, Canty." "Okay, but they grow out of it, see? They get to know more. The best thing is to ignore it, and after a bit they'll stop. They get used to you. They forget you look different." "But I don't get used to them," Raj had said sternly, sticking out his lower lip. "Not when they're mean, and I don't want to." Canty walked past the palm tree, up the steps, in through the wide glass doors. Raj's classroom was halfway down the passage, opposite the art room, and his teacher, Mrs. Hopkins, was standing in the doorway sipping a mug of steaming coffee. Behind her, he could see Raj slumped at a table near the front of the room. He had his head down and was kicking at the table leg. Thump, thump, thump. A maddening sound that had probably driven Mrs. Hopkins out of the room to stand there at the door. She'd have told him to stop it, and he'd have gone right on doing it anyway. Raj looked a mess. The collar of his shirt was torn, there was a bruise forming on his cheek and a cut above his eye, dark and crusty where the blood had dried. Mrs. Hopkins hadn't washed it or anything. "What happened?" The question burst from Canty abruptly, and it must have sounded rude, because the teacher frowned at him. He added quickly, "Mrs. Hopkins?" "Raj was telling stories," she said, "and one of the other children confronted him." Confronted? Canty knew at once there'd been another fight. "Stories?" he echoed, puzzled. "Lies. He was telling lies." The word sounded harsh, and Mrs. Hopkins must have realised this. "Fibs," she corrected. "He was telling fibs." "Raj never tells," she cut him off. "Children do tell fibs," she said. "It doesn't mean they're bad. Raj isn't bad." She ignored this too. "Telling fibs can be a way small children draw attention to themselves," she explained, "particularly when they—" She glanced at Raj and then looked Canty up and down, taking in his shabby state school uniform. "Don't have the advantages other children do." She said this last bit about lack of advantages in the most ordinary way. She could have been talking about the weather, nothing personal at all. She didn't seem to have the faintest idea it might sound insulting. The awful thing was how it made Canty feel like defending himself, bursting into a long account of how his grandfather had gone to Oxford and his father was a doctor, even if he wasn't allowed to practice here, and how his mother spoke 3 languages and had been headmistress of a school that was 1,000 times better than this crummy place where Mrs. Hopkins taught, and how the country they'd come from wasn't all thatched huts and jungle drums and monkey trees. But he didn't say any of it. He knew by now that Mrs. Hopkins might think such an angry speech hysterical. She could even think, like their neighbour Mrs. Twomey, that the spicy food his people ate heated up their blood. He walked past her to Raj's table. "Hey," he said, and his brother looked up at him. "Hey, what happened to you?" "It wasn't a fib," Raj said, flashing a scornful glance at Mrs. Hopkins. "I wasn't telling fibs." "I know." Behind him, Canty sensed anger in the clash of Mrs. Hopkins' coffee mug down on the teacher's table. "I know, but what did you say that the other kid thought was a story?" "It was our house. There was a picture of our house in the library book." "Our house?" For a moment, Canty was baffled. They lived behind the milk bar their father had bought when they came here. Small mixed business was how it had been described in the newspaper column. Opportunity. "It's only till we get settled," their father had reassured them. "Till we work things out and find our feet." "The milk bar?" said Canty. He couldn't understand why a picture of a milk bar had caused a fight, unless Raj had insisted he didn't live in a shabby house like that. "No!" Raj was shouting now. "The other house, you know." Shock prickled at Canty's scalp. Of course he knew the other house, but he'd never realised Raj did. He hadn't thought his brother remembered anything from home. He'd been so little when they'd had to leave. "You know," Raj sketched an elegant shape with his hands. "Our house, the one where we used to live. It had white flowers on the veranda." Jasmine. Canty took a deep breath. He could almost smell the sweet scent of those small white blossoms drifting through the windows of his old bedroom. "It had a name," said Raj. "Our house. It was called something. It was called what was it, Canty?" "Dilkusha," the older boy said softly. That was the name of the house their grandfather had built when he'd first come to Kampala. It had been the name of a house he'd loved back in India, a summer bungalow in the small hill station of Missouri. "Yes," Raj clapped his hands. "There was a picture of it, of Dilkusha, in this big book in the library. I opened the page and there it was, and I said to Gary Burns, 'That's our house.' And then—" Raj's voice faltered and burst back loud and angry. "Gary Burns said, 'In your dreams.'" Of course Gary Burns would say that if he saw a picture of Dilkusha, thought Canty. You could tell at a glance that Dilkusha was a rich person's house, so how could someone like Raj live there? Raj jumped to his feet. "It was our house, wasn't it? We did have a house like that." He sketched that graceful shape again, with those verandas and the white flowers and the wooden things on the windows, those slatty things. "Yes, I knew!" Raj turned his glowing face to Mrs. Hopkins. "See, I told you, didn't I?" Canty fought back a smile. Despite the trouble Raj got into, it was hard not to smile at him sometimes. The way he'd been at school for nearly 2 years and never learnt how you were supposed to talk to teachers. "And you said I was telling stories," Raj scoffed at Mrs. Hopkins. "Shh," whispered Canty, trying to calm him. "Mrs. Hopkins believes you now." "No, she doesn't." Raj began kicking at the table leg again. Thud, thud, thud. "It's time you learned some self-control, Regina Shah," Mrs. Hopkins said coldly. "I don't want to, and you can't make me." The way the teacher's face puckered then, screwed up with distaste, reminded Canty of Mrs. Twomey again, of that time Raj had fought with her son Jason outside the milk bar. Jason was bigger, 8 years old at least, but Raj had beaten him. "Of course, I know Raj can't help himself," Mrs. Twomey had said to old Mrs. Evans, who'd come out to the street to see what the noise was about. "It's in his blood, isn't it? Their blood is hotter than ours." Their mother had been upset by that remark. "All blood is the same," she said to Mrs. Twomey. And somehow Canty had known she was thinking of that day in Kampala when they'd passed the Patel's store, smashed up, glass scattered on the road, and those thick, dark stains soaking into the curb. "May I see the picture?" he asked Raj's teacher now. She looked at him blankly. "What picture?" "The one in the library book, the one of the house that he's been talking about." "Oh," Mrs. Hopkins sounded reluctant. You couldn't blame her, thought Canty. It was almost 4 o'clock. She'd want to get off home. She wasn't old or anything, but she probably had kids of her own. He knew he was expecting too much, at least for a kid in state school uniform with a brown, unfamiliar skin. If he'd been a private school boy, even a brown one, here, Canty caught himself up sharply. He hated the way that he'd begun to think like this. It was insidious, drops of anger and humiliation wearing away at your heart. "Please," he said in his father's gentle, cultivated voice, and saw the surprise in the teacher's eyes that such a voice would come from a boy like him. "I'd very much appreciate it, Mrs. Hopkins." "I suppose it will only take a minute," she sighed, and they walked down the corridor to the library room. The book was on a high shelf behind the teacher's table. Raj spotted it at once. "It's there," he cried, pointing, jumping up and down. "That's it." Mrs. Hopkins took it from the shelf and had it out of reach. "Clean hands," she said to Raj. He held his palms out. She frowned when she saw them and handed the book to Canty. When he placed it on the table, Raj darted at once to his side. "It's here, he gabbled, helping to turn the pages. "Careful," said Canty. It was a big, thick book called Houses of the World. On page 11, Canty stopped turning. "See?" cried Raj exultantly. "See?" It wasn't their house, but one so very like it. The same wide windows, the slatted shutters, the long veranda with the jasmine twining round the rails, that for a moment Canty was back there, as if he'd fallen right in through the page. He was standing on the veranda, looking down the shallow steps across the lawn. He could feel the smooth, warm boards beneath his bare feet, smell the scents of roses and jasmine and sweet wet earth. It was early morning. The sprinklers were turning before the heat of day, and there was Rekha, skipping at the edge of the falling water, her little hands held out to catch the drops on her palms. "Canty," she called in her baby voice. "Canty, look, I've got diamonds, see?" Dilkusha. It meant place of heart's gladness, and that's what Kampala had been for all of them. They'd had to leave. Indians weren't wanted in that country anymore. It wasn't their country, they were told, even if they'd been born there and it felt like theirs and they had no other place. They didn't belong, and nothing that had belonged to them either. They'd stolen it from the country's true people. That's what they were told. Canty's family was late in getting away. Most of their friends had gone, packed into planes at the airport, but they'd stayed on too late. There was fighting through the country, and Canty's father was a doctor. He thought he was needed there. The soldiers came for him early one morning, thundering at the door. "Go," he'd whispered to their mother. "Now, you must go." They'd left that night by train towards the border. Their mother had been nervous at the airport. She'd thought they might stop her there, detain her too, and take the children away. Canty had only been 11 then. Raj was 4, and Rekha hadn't turned 3. They wouldn't have known what to do. Their mother had thought the train would be safer, and it had seemed so at first. They'd taken the slow train, the ordinary one that stopped at every little station, carrying people home from the city to their villages out in the bush. No one had been unkind to them. No one jeered or shouted. It had seemed they'd be safe. And then Canty had noticed something. People weren't smiling at Raj and Rekha like they always did, even since the troubles had begun, those special smiles that grown-ups give to tiny little kids. The brief gazes that turned in their direction had been grave and full of warning before people looked away. They could have been saying silently, "Be careful now." The soldiers boarded a few miles from the bridge. Canty had taken Raj down to the end of the train while his mother settled Rekha to sleep. There was a bigger window down there, not that there was much to see, only the great starry sky and the dark country streaming past. Then the train had stopped. "Why?" Raj had wanted to know. "Why has it stopped?" Canty shrugged. He didn't know himself. "To let some people off," he'd said. They hadn't known about the soldiers until, above the clatter of the train, they heard their mother screaming. They ran then. At the door of their own carriage, another traveller pulled them back, and the big solid bodies of strangers hid them from the soldier's sight. Warm hands had covered Canty's eyes. He had seen all the same. He had seen his mother standing, screaming. She had blood on her ears, trickling down over the lobes where her earrings had been. The soldiers were all around her, and one of them had Rekha in his arms. He was holding her up high, and then higher and higher, always out of reach. He was teasing their mother with Rekha, like Canty and Raj used to tease their old dog Charlie with a bone. Only they'd always given Charlie the bone after a little bit. The soldier hadn't given Rekha back to them. The train had begun to move again. Someone had smashed the window out beside their seat. Its pieces were scattered everywhere. One moment, Rekha had been there in the soldier's big hands, and then she wasn't anymore. He was holding nothing then. Their mother sank down on the seat without a sound. The wind rushed through the window and the train roared on across the bridge. Even now, Canty could remember how all the noise had seemed to come from outside. Inside the carriage there was a deep human hush, a sorrowful breath indrawn. In the little library room of Raj's school, Canty closed the book called Houses of the World. See? Raj tugged at his sleeve. I was telling the truth, wasn't I? Yes, you were. Canty turned to Mrs. Hopkins. We did have a house like that, he told her, though she didn't say in your dreams like Gary Burns had done. He could see from her face she didn't quite believe him. When we lived in Kampala, he added. Kerala? Kampala. It's a place in Africa. Africa? Now she looked puzzled, and he knew she was wondering why, as they were Indian, that they had lived in Africa. We had to leave, he told her. So we lost our house and everything. Oh, she sounded uneasy now. Yes, well, she made a small fluttery movement with one hand as if to ward their troubles away. They were nothing to do with her, those painful events that happened on the other side of the world, and no excuse for Raj's behaviour either. No excuse for fighting and bad manners and lack of control. They were like that, Kenny thought bitterly, these people that they lived amongst now. They didn't want to hear. He'd watched them reading their newspapers in the trains and buses, skipping the foreign news, turning the pages to get to the other side. When bombs began falling and the news was on the front page, they didn't like it. Always trouble in those places, Mrs. Toomey would grumble, collecting his son from the milk bar counter, scanning the headlines, disapproval on his face. No self-control, his wife might have added. But you really can't blame them, can you? Their blood is hotter than ours. Canty placed Houses of the World back on its shelf and then said to Mrs. Hopkins, I think he should apologise. Oh, he has, she answered. I saw to that. You were sorry. You said you were sorry, didn't you, Raj, for fibbing? Raj didn't answer. All the fight seemed to drain from him suddenly. He lowered his eyes and stared miserably at the floor. I meant the other boy, Canty said to Mrs. Hopkins. The one who said, in your dreams? He's the one who should apologise. And before she could say anything, he took Raj's hand and walked away. The street where they lived now was flat and treeless. The moment you turned the corner, you could see their milk bar down at the other end, the big plastic ice cream perched on its roof like an upturned witch's hat. When you walked through the door, you saw the other counter with the trays of lollies under glass, the ones little kids bought with their pocket money, mint leaves and musk sticks, cobbers and freckles and footy bubble gum. His mother kept getting them mixed up, and then the little kids would make her do it again. She spoke 3 languages, but the names of these lollies just didn't seem to stick. On the shelves above the counter were the groceries, gravox and baked beans, flour and sugar and salt, sweet corn and pet food and breakfast cereals. Posters for ice cream and sergeant's pies glowed from the walls. They lived in the back, in 4 small rooms behind a curtain of plastic strips. It was as far away from Dilkusha as you could ever get. After Kampala, they'd gone to London, where their father had joined them when he'd been released. Their mother had hated London. The cold, the way the dark came down in winter, the damp grey streets, the wet clothes freezing on the line. In some ways, she liked it better here. There was something about the light on summer evenings which reminded her of home. But she couldn't teach like she'd done back in Kampala. Her qualifications weren't accepted, and neither were their father's. He'd had to start studying all over again and working at the mail centre on the night shift because their milk bar didn't make much money. It was the strangest thing to be poor, when once he'd been rich and strong. It wasn't simply the lack of all those things Canty had once taken for granted. It was the way his present life never seemed quite real. In the mornings when he opened the door on the street to take in the milk and bread, he half expected to find the garden of Dilkusha, the dusty road beyond the gate, the different sky and air. He had this sense all the time that the world was flimsy and you could step right through. "We did have a house like that, didn't we?" Raj asked suddenly. "Like the picture in the book?" "Yes." Raj squeezed his brother's hand. "Good. I thought so. I thought I remembered it." "Did you remember it before you saw it in the book?" Raj frowned. "I don't know. I must have thought, though, mustn't I? Otherwise I wouldn't have recognized it." "Yes!" Canty fell silent. What if Raj started remembering other things? He'd always thought Raj had been too little to have memories from Kampala, and they never talked about that time. In those rooms behind the milk bar, there was never a word spoken about their beautiful lost country, or Dilkusha, so that sometimes Canty did think it might have been a dream. They never spoke of Rekha either, the little sister who used to wait at the gate for Canty to come home from school. Rekha who used to sing herself to sleep at night, sweet songs without any words which drifted through the house and made everyone smile. Sometimes Canty almost hated his mother and father for never speaking of her, never saying her name, shutting her out, a poor little ghost left wandering, tapping at the doors and windows, crying, "Let me in, oh please, 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 let me come in." He understood why they were silent. It was because they were afraid. He was afraid for Raj now he'd seen the picture and remembered Dilkusha. It might bring back things that were better forgotten, like the soldier chucking Rekha through the window as if she'd never lived or breathed or sung those wordless songs. Memory could be like those big ant hills in the bush around their old home. Leave them alone and a few stray ants might wander out, stir them up, and savagery came swarming around your feet. He knew he should leave Raj alone, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know if his brother remembered more. "It was a beautiful house, wasn't it?" he prompted, and then stood waiting, tensely, to hear what Raj would say. "Oh, yes!" His brother's face lit with a pleasure Canty knew he wouldn't have felt if he'd also had memories of what had happened at the end. He didn't remember Rekha then. He thought that was sad. Perhaps it was good as well. Perhaps he couldn't be miserable about her. Raj grinned at him happily, picking up a long stick from the nature strip, and went skipping on ahead, rattling it along the fences. Canty walked on slowly. The thing he kept remembering was the soldier's face, the soldier who'd taken Rekha away. It was a young face. Canty could see that now. A silly kid's face, flushed with a kind of pride, the sort of pride someone very poor and despised and young might feel if you gave him a uniform and shiny boots and a gun and then told him who to hate and blame for all that was bad and wrong. The soldier was no different from those kids Canty could see now on the other side of the street, laughing and horsing around on their way home from school. Ordinary, clueless. He'd got caught up, thought Canty. If those kids over there had been in his place, they might have acted just the same. It was an idea that always made him feel sick at heart, how ordinary people might turn savage if you gave them the right occasion. He quickened his footsteps. Up ahead, Raj was almost at the Twomey's house, and Canty ran to catch him before he could rattle his stick along their fence. Raj didn't touch it, though. He'd seen Mrs. Twomey out there on her front veranda, waiting for them to pass, hoping that they'd do something she could pick on. She hated them long before Raj's fight with Jason. She'd turned against them that time Dad had asked her to stop Jason writing stuff on the back wall of their milk bar, stuff like Asians out and blacks go home. "Why don't you go back from where you came from?" Jason Twomey jeered whenever he saw them in the street. Mrs. Twomey had got really angry with their father. She'd said her son would never have written those words up on the wall. He knew right from wrong because he'd been brought up properly. When they'd passed her house, Raj raised his stick again because the fence next door had iron railings, which made a lovely hollow sound. "I'm watching you," Mrs. Twomey called from her veranda, and Raj's shoulders slumped and his arm fell back to his side. Her voice and the way she waited to catch them out made Canty hate her. He knew he had to fight the feeling back. Hate always messed you up. People like the Twomeys were ignorant, that was all. Innocent even. When they took the train, it was to go into work or into town for shopping or the cinema, not to flee for their very lives. The terrible thing that had come to his own family, the Twomeys couldn't conceive of it. They lived in a country where such things didn't happen, and they thought they never could. It was hard not to hate them sometimes, even to wish bombs would start falling so they'd know it could happen anywhere, or to start thinking of them as those people. He tried to stop himself doing that. He knew it was part of a process. You started thinking those people, and then they didn't count or matter and anything could be done to them. In Kampala, his own family had been those people. "There's Kenny!" Raj dropped his stick and raced up on the street. Kenny, Mr. Sinclair, and his wife Irene lived 3 doors down from the milk bar, and they were really nice. They'd asked Canty's family to a barbecue. His mother had taken a tray of samosas and budgies and a jar of mango pickle too. Kenny and Irene had really loved that food. And the time Raj had the fight with Jason Twomey, when their mother had said all blood is the same, Kenny had known what she'd meant by that. He hadn't thought she was weird. "You've been in the wars again," he said to Raj now, catching sight of the bruise and the small cut on his forehead. "You know what happened?" Raj asked eagerly. "You tell me." "This kid said, 'in your dreams' to me." Raj punched his fist in the air, so I bashed him. Because he shouldn't have said that, should he? When you say something that's true, people shouldn't say, "in your dreams." They shouldn't say you're telling lies. "No," said Kenny, his grey eyes serious. "They shouldn't." A lady came up the path behind him. It wasn't Irene. Mrs. Sinclair was small and plump. This lady was tall like Kenny, and she had the same round, freckled face and sandy hair. "This is Dolly," said Kenny, and the lady smiled at Raj and Canty, her eyes crinkling at the corners in the same way that Kenny's did. "Just look at you," she said to Raj. "What happened?" Raj told her. "I think you'd better come with me," said Dolly, "and I'll tidy you up a bit before you go home to Mum." She held out her hand to him. Raj didn't take it. His eyes fastened on her red scarf. It was made of a fine, silky stuff, and the breeze caught at it, sent it streaming, rippling. Raj frowned. Canty knew his brother hated the colour red. He wouldn't wear anything red, and he hated other people wearing the colour too. Their mother had a red sari blouse, and whenever she wore it, Raj scowled, and if it was one of his cranky days, he might start yelling for her to take it off. He yelled at Canty's red t-shirt and their father's crimson socks. They'd asked him over and over why he didn't like that colour, but all he ever said was, "because." He didn't know why. That's what Canty thought. The frown Raj got when he saw something red was the kind you saw on kids' faces when a teacher asked them a question about a book they hadn't read. "You don't like this, do you?" said Dolly now, putting a hand up to her scarf. Raj shook his head, and then Dolly whipped the scarf from her collar and hid it in her pocket out of sight. "There," she said, smiling at him. "All gone." She held out her hand, and Raj took it this time. While Dolly and Raj were in the bathroom, Canty sat in the kitchen with Kenny, sipping a frosty glass of Coke. "Dolly's my little sister," explained Kenny. "She's visiting us from—" Canty never heard from where. Kenny went on talking while Canty's brain stuck fast on those 2 words, little sister. He'd heard them hundreds of times. The kids at school were always talking about their families, but somehow, this time, perhaps because he'd seen that picture in Raj's library book and thought of Rekha, Canty's hand trembled. Drops of Coke spilled from his glass and he began to cry. It was years since he'd cried. The last time had been in London after their father had been released. It should have been a happy time, but when his father came out through the airport arrival doors alone, Canty had started crying. He'd let himself believe that Rekha would be with him. He'd honestly believed she'd be there. For weeks and weeks, ever since they'd learnt of the release, Canty had told himself this story every night in bed. How Rekha hadn't died when she'd fallen from the train, how some kind person living out there by the river had found his sister and looked after her. And when his father got out of prison, he'd find a letter waiting, he'd go off to this little village in the bush, and it was amazing what you could make yourself believe when you were desperate. Anyway, his father had come through the doors alone at Heathrow, and that was the last time Canty had cried. Till now. Now he was crying again in the Sinclair's kitchen when he was 14 and far too old for tears, and too old for the words he found himself blurting out to Kenny. I had a little sister once. He didn't say more than that. He didn't tell Kenny how Rekha had died because it was too terrible, too much the kind of thing people like Mrs. Twomey thought they did to each other over there. He knew Kenny wasn't like Mrs. Twomey. He knew he'd understand, but somehow Canty had grown afraid to trust. She died, was all he said. Canty didn't say anything for a long, long moment, and when he did, it was something Canty would never have expected. When my dad died, Kenny began slowly, my brother Dan and I, we took his clothes off the line and hid them from our mum. We hid them in this box in the laundry. We didn't want her to see them, he added softly. And you know what? I think we didn't want to see them either. We just wanted to put it all away, out of sight, you know? I know, said Canty. He saw how Kenny's face looked shy and uncertain, as if he thought telling the story mightn't be any help, but he was offering it all the same. We were only kids, Kenny sighed. That's a silly expression, isn't it? Only kids, as if when something bad or terrible happens to a child instead of an adult, it's never as painful or real. Their mother had had a bad day. Kenny could sense it the moment that they came in through the door. She got really fed up sometimes, standing behind the counter all day, putting those lollies into little bags, making sandwiches and heating pies up in the microwave. And sometimes Mrs. Twomey would come in to buy milk or bread and make one of those remarks their mother hated. You're lucky, aren't you, she'd say, to be allowed to come here when there's so much unemployment. Or she'd go on about Raj being cheeky to her. Perhaps Mrs. Twomey had been in today because their mother got upset the moment she saw Raj had been in another fight. Fighting, always fighting, she scolded. Why are you like this? Raj always got sulky when she scolded. No one's going to say in your dreams to me. In your dreams? What is this? He didn't answer her, not properly. He didn't explain about the library book or the picture of the house which looked like Dilkusha. He was afraid to, thought Canty. And he didn't know why he was afraid. No one's going to say it, Raj repeated, his voice rising on the words, his mouth taking on that crooked, snarly shape which always made Canty think of tigers. And if they do, I'm going to bash them and bash them and bash them. His mother grabbed his arm. With her free hand, she tipped Raj's chin up and gazed into his face. Look at you. Listen to yourself. Listen to what you're saying. Why do you sound like... He twisted away from her. Like me? A little thug, she said bleakly. That's what you sound like, and that's what you're turning into. She sank down onto the old sofa and began to cry. They didn't know what to do. Canty knew she cried sometimes at night. He'd heard her through the thin wall of their bedroom and the soft murmur of his father's voice trying to comfort her. But she'd never cried in front of them before. I can't bear it, she sobbed. I can't. Canty patted her shoulder awkwardly. Ma, don't. It's all right. Please don't. She looked up at him. No, it isn't. It isn't all right. He used to be the sweetest, gentlest child. Do you remember, Canty? Do you remember how he was? Yes, but listen, Ma, he's okay. He's okay now. He's not turning into a thug or anything. It's just that... She wasn't listening to him. Her eyes looked funny, staring beyond him into some private place. And all at once, as if she'd forgotten how they never spoke of it, she began talking about the time when Raj was really small, before they'd had to leave Kampala. As if she was back there, walking through those other larger rooms, the airy rooms of Dilkusha, opening doors and raising blinds to let in the day, showing them all those things they'd had to leave behind. Except for Rekha. She didn't mention Rekha once. All this time, Raj had been staring at her mother silently, a queer absorbed expression on his face. Now he began shouting. His arm shot out stiffly, one stern finger pointing at her bright red sari blouse. "You're wearing it!" he screamed. "And you know I hate it! You know!" He rushed at her, grabbing at her sleeve. There was a long, ripping sound as the seam gave way and a piece came free in his hand. He gazed at it for a long time before he dropped it on the floor. Then he rushed at her again. "Raj!" Kanti grabbed at his brother's flailing arms. Raj kicked at him. "Just look at him," their mother cried. "He's like a wild thing." She fingered the torn edge of her blouse. "Why does he hate a colour? Why would anyone?" Her eyes were as wild as his. "Why?" she cried again. "I don't know," said Kanti. "I've never been able to work it out." "Because," answered Raj like he always did. "Because. Why do you keep saying that?" his mother demanded. Because. Raj went still in Kanti's arms. He tipped his head back against his brother's chest. Kanti felt the sudden, surprising weight of it. "Because," said Raj. "Because of Rekha." "Rekha?" Their mother's hand flew to her mouth as if to push the name back in. Raj wouldn't let her. "Yes, Rekha. She had a red dress and red ribbons here." Raj touched lightly at the place above his ears. Kanti had forgotten that. Forgotten the colour of the dress his sister had worn that night. Forgotten how her hair had been plaited, looped, tied with red ribbons up above her ears. He'd forgotten how when the soldier thrust her small body through the shattered window, one red ribbon had caught there, hung on the splintered wood for a second after she'd gone, until the wind had caught it and sent it streaming like a narrow banner away in the sky. "Red," said Raj again. "Rekha was wearing red in that train." "Oh, Raj." Their mother held her arms out and he ran inside them. "Poor Raj," she whispered, and then looked at her oldest son. "And poor Kanti." "And Rekha," insisted Raj. "Rekha too." They huddled together on the sofa, Raj on his mother's lap, Kanti close beside her. "She was my sister, wasn't she?" asked Raj. "And she was real, not just in my dreams." His mother nodded. "She was real." "She's dead, isn't she?" His mother nodded again. "I thought so," said Raj slowly. "I thought she was, only I couldn't know." His fingers clutched tightly at his mother's arm. "I wanted to know. I needed to." She stroked his cheek again and he said shyly, "I can remember her, I think. Just a little bit. She used to sing, didn't she?" "Yes, she used to sing." And as they sat there on the sofa, Kanti had a strange sense that their small, cramped living room had suddenly grown larger, the walls swept back, the ceiling risen high above their heads. There was space, and that same blithe airiness that had flowed through the halls and verandas of Dilkusha. As if in their shabby old milk bar, an invisible door had been pushed open, and his little invisible sister had come dancing in.